Welcome back to everyone. Our fifth and final panel for the World Leadership Alliance, Club de Madrid, Boston Global Forum, Policy Lab on Transatlantic Approaches on Digital Governance, a New Social Contract in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. We'll examine multi-stakeholder initiatives and the multilateral system, global cooperation to build a common digital future. International digital cooperation cannot be led exclusively by governments or through multilateral efforts. It also requires cooperative structures that involve a full range of stakeholders, including technology companies, civil society, academics, and technology specialists to address the social, ethical, legal, political, and economic impact of digital technologies. Session 5, Multi-Stakeholder Initiatives in the Multilateral System, Global Cooperation to Build a Common Digital Future, will consider the groundwork necessary for building multi-stakeholder consensus for adapting the multilateral framework for a digital future based on equity, privacy, and people-centered values. This session will provide insights for building inclusive policy-making processes towards global digital cooperation that engage diverse actors to better prepare for current and future challenges in this field. This session will be facilitated by Professor Thomas Patterson, Research Director at the Michael Dukakis Institute for Leadership and Innovation, and Bradley Professor of Government and the Press at Harvard's Kennedy School. He is also the author of How America Lost Its Mind, the Assault on Reason That's Crippling Our Democracy. Welcome back, Professor Patterson.
Thank you. And welcome to our panel on global cooperation in the building of a digital future. There's a lot of work to be done at the national and subnational levels to build a bright AI future. But data transcends national boundaries. Digital is a global issue, and we need to think globally in addressing it. Before turning to our distinguished panelists, let me briefly describe a global initiative of the Boston Global. Headed by Mark Rotenberg, who moderated one of yesterday's panels, we're creating an AI social contract index. The index will track the AI policies and practices of countries according to ethical standards in the areas of human rights, rule of law, and bureaucratic and democratic governance. The index will be published annually and will help us to understand nations' progress or lack thereof in creating a promising digital future. As with other Boston Global Forum initiatives, we invite your suggestion in creating and implementing the Social Contract Index. Let me now turn to our distinguished panelists for their thoughts on building the digital future. I'll introduce each panelist in turn, starting with Alfred Gusenbauer, who was Austria's federal chancellor a decade ago. His distinguished career also includes having served in both chambers of Austria's parliament and heading Austria's Social Democratic Party. Chancellor Gusenbauer.
Okay. Of what we're discussing today. It is about a world that gives room to everyone. And it's also good to talk in terms of, I'm a big defender of the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. It's about having a good life for everyone in this world. And at this moment you can be concerned about the cooperation between countries, because there are a lot of own national interests. And the questioning between countries, I think we should do much more, so we need multilateral approaches. At the same moment, we have to take into account the position of vulnerability, that poor and miserable people are really suffering because of what's happening now. And therefore, it is good to underline the fact that the multi-stakeholder approach and that we are making the right choices for the future. When we talk about artificial intelligence, there are so many possibilities to find the right solutions, but I think we're also missing chances at the moment. So therefore, it is important to look each other in the eyes in the right way. And therefore, if you talk about what's necessary today. We need a multi-stakeholder approach. We must have common challenges, and we have to be very honest in our discussion. I'm a bit concerned that in the world of today, there's a lot of national interest. We talk about populism, nationalism, that are necessary today. So, be aware of the necessity to have a global agenda, the SDGs. Be aware of the vulnerable groups and society, the possibilities of artificial intelligence, and we must have a multi-stakeholder approach. That is what I would like to underline, and now I'm looking forward to the contribution of others.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Now I'll turn to Mr. Nam Pham. He's the Assistant Secretary of Business Development and International Trade for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and he's been a close associate of the Boston Global Forum. Mr. Nam Pham.
Yes, I'm sorry, I was muting. Let me say that it is a real honor for me to partake in this forum from Massachusetts. As we know, we are a very small state, but often we take pride in having a bigger impact than our small size. We are a good example of size does not matter, but how much one can contribute. After all, our Boston Global Forum, a very small think tank, has been a key partner of the great discussion we have had the last 3 days. I just like to share with you a couple of points. First, my most favorite quote from Albert Einstein is that imagination is more important than knowledge. For knowledge is limited, whereas imagination embraces the entire world, stimulating progress, giving birth to evolution. It is, strictly speaking, a real factor in scientific research. If I may add just a little thought into this famous quote of his, imagination can also give birth not just to evolution, but also revolution. And imagination is not just a real factor in scientific research, but also in government policies. After all, our knowledge of AI is still limited, but our imagination of what it can do is infinite. What the Boston Global Forum, World Leadership Alliance, Club de Madrid, and all of us are doing is visioning a better AI world society. We are imagining a more just, more humane, and more accountable world using the advancement of AI and other technologies. We are also imagining that human is the locus of all we do. As the Prime Minister of Finland, Stubb, has stated many times, of the need for a human-centered approach. I totally agree with Prime Minister Stubb. I would also like to recite a point in the AIWS social contract for the AI age, which was revealed on September 9, 2020, this year. The social contract seeks to build a world where all are recognized and valued, and all forms of governance adhere to a set of values and are accountable and transparent. It is a world where global challenges are met by collective actions and responsibility. In this contract, there are 6 principles. I just want to point out 2, which I think are the most important, and I think many of us have mentioned about this during various discussions. Principle number 1, AI must respect fundamental human rights such as human dignity, rule of law, and privacy protection. And principle number 4, the social contract for the AI age should be transparent and accountable and follow standards based on policies driven by trustworthy data. And whenever we talk about respect for human rights, government transparency, and accountability, and technology, I often think of the Chinese government, and I think many of us do so. Let us take a second and imagine that if the Chinese government had just a little more respect for human rights, a little more transparency for its governance, and the world could have held it to a little more accountability for its actions, we would have a much better world and definitely no COVID-19 pandemic. The social contract for the AI age is established by our collective imagination. Like any contract, if it is not enforceable or respected, it would not have much value. Our AI social contract value is dependent on our collective resolve and collective actions to hold all accountable in some fashion. Thus, I wholeheartedly applaud the Boston Global Forum, the World Leadership Alliance Club de Madrid for their efforts to have this wonderful transatlantic discussion. In this current messy world, we need to have a lot more international collaboration to make our world, AI or non-AI, a better one. On behalf of Massachusetts, I hope to have opportunities to welcome all of you to our state in person in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nam Pham, and let me echo that last sentiment. We had hoped to hold much of this conference here in Boston at Harvard, but we're doing it virtually, and I think all of us at the Boston Global Forum look forward to the day when we'll be together in person here, talking about these same issues, but in an advanced stage as it moves along in the months and years ahead. Next, we're going to hear from Rebecca Leeper. Now, she is at once the youngest member of the panel, but also the most knowledgeable about AI, a software engineer. Ms. Leeper.
Thank you. And thanks to Global Forum de Madrid for the conference. My journey is that I am the youngest, and my digital tech begins in 1996 when I was born. So I've never known a world without instant messaging, social media, online shopping, GPS, cameras everywhere, streaming services, and learning apps in and out of the classroom. The Internet of Things and social media in particular is part of me and my identity. So in 2017, after working on an autonomous weapon at Textron Weapons and Sensor Systems, I pursued research into cybersecurity and AI at the United Nations office in Geneva, Switzerland. I met and discussed with ambassadors, NGO leaders, security experts like everyone here on the panel, and advocates. I later returned to Geneva in 2018 and 2019 for the AI for Good conferences. It's at these conferences that the good that AI and big data processing can do is highlighted. How AI can and will transform the healthcare sector, help migrants and refugees find safety and shelter, prevent and map violence and natural disasters, and connect the world so information and education can reach everyone. Through this work and research positions at the Belfer Center at Harvard and the Global Resiliency Institute at Northeastern, and my own experience of being hacked and my sensitive personal and financial data being leaked, I found my passion for privacy, computer networks, and ethical artificial intelligence, and I now work as a developer at Dataductus, a software in the networking cloud space, working with service providers to help them automate and migrate to the cloud. As a software engineer, I do see firsthand how computing power and machine learning is advanced, which of course has great benefit to society, and I am by no means against the development of such technology. Ethical AI can save the world. I truly believe that. But as discovered and researched by experts all over the world, we can identify the existing and emerging threats of AI and the harm it can do if not mindfully regulated, developed, and monitored. Such systems like facial recognition technology that help to secure our phones can and have exacerbated racism, particularly when deployed in law enforcement. Lead researchers like Joy Buolamwini out of MIT have exposed the disproportionate rates of victims when identifying and matching particularly women of color. If deployed in the US, for example, and it has already begun in some regions, it will be overused and underperform on our Black and Brown communities. And there are other more subtle but no less dangerous risks related to data sharing, the proliferation of fake news, and the expansion of AI-driven surveillance, to name a few. The infrastructure and connecting to the internet only a threat landscape, making states and us more attacks. The private and public sectors are rapidly adapting to the cloud computing environment for information storage, and the internet is being used to manage electric power generation of food, water, energy, transportation, healthcare, and financial services also depend heavily on the internet and information technology. Cisco estimated that there would be more than 50 billion devices by this year, and advisory predicts 120 million by 2030. As noted, smart are now the backdoor into our energy grid. The Mirai botnet, which reached more than 100 countries and nearly took the net in the US in 2016, was amassed by exploiting vulnerabilities in closed-circuit television cameras and routers that were connected to the internet. Greatly linked to this, on personal data to operations without knowing it's being and censored, as well as the increasing ways governments can surveil us. Lastly, lethal autonomous weapons are, of course, of great concern. So we have to do something, and that's why under the Boston Global Forum and with AIWS Net, I launched the Common Good Framework in 2018. And the Common Good Digital Framework is purposed at identifying and monitoring both good and poor digital practices for ethical and policy. Establishing ourselves as a working group of leaders who can provide counsel and consultation, stimulate and galvanize society towards the needs and regulations, and therein influence AI and cyber policy. Partners in CGDF are data and evidence when governments, as well as good cybersecurity practices. To violations, our partners join together our voice, resources, and platforms, serving as change agents and advocates, contributing solutions and recommendations. Really critical here is to create that span and the disciplines, engage advocates, researchers, and experts at every career, every level of government, in the academic world, and particularly in the private sector. Only then can the CGDF develop comprehensive solutions and truly currently very small but committed. I work with my two research colleagues, Bala Sumaya Domet, an international peace researcher in Lebanon, and Zetter, economics researcher from Switzerland. So just finished project surveillance, examining China's surveillance model and to what extent the US is on a trajectory towards digital authoritarianism. Our paper and more information about this can be found on the AIWS Net website and on my Twitter @rleaper. This is also growing as we've just brought on a new researcher, Jonathan Crump from Switzerland. And as was mentioned in the beginning of this panel, our next project is in partnership with the Center for AI and Digital Policy and will be a global survey of the top 25 GDP countries evaluating their AI policies and practices in 2020 and over time. We're so excited to take on this project with Mark Ruttenberg, a distinguished privacy expert who joined the conference yesterday. And with that, I'm honored to be here and look forward to this panel.
Ms. Laper, thank you. Our next panelist is Audrey Ozole, who was France's Minister of Culture from 2016 to 2017, and since 2017 has been Director General of UNESCO. Ms. Ozole. Is she not with us this morning? Is Chancellor Gusenbauer now with us in terms of being able to? Well, it looks like we're going to have a lot of time to talk about what's been said. I have a couple of questions, but before I ask them, any of the panelists, is there anything that you heard from the others that you'd like to respond to or elaborate upon?
Have you identified all the panelists?
Yep.
I think one is missing, and I think we're having connection problems with one of the panelists.
Well, I'm still out here. This is Jerry Jones. Can you hear me?
Oh, Jerry, hi. You were not on my list, Jerry, but I can introduce you. So Jerry was with me on that first day. So Jerry Jones is from Little Rock, Arkansas, and runs a firm there, and was a partner, by the way, in the Rose Law Firm, and probably at the time that Hillary Clinton was also at that firm. Is that right, Jerry?
That's very true. We were partners for about 12 years.
Yeah. So, Jerry, I'm sorry I didn't, you weren't on my list, or maybe I'd have moved you to the, so you get to go last. You get to clean up here. So,
all right.
Please.
Well, thank you very much. It's always an honor and a privilege to be with this group. In the last session, Prime Minister Stubbs mentioned the social dimension documentary of sorts on Netflix, I believe. And I want to compliment the Club de Madrid because it was about 2 years ago when we had a conference in San Francisco where some of the people that were behind the social dimension documentary were at one of our conferences. Folks such as Tristan Harris, Renee DiRapista, and Roger McEnany, where we were delving into 2 years ago the same issues that documentary is digging into at the present time. And I want to compliment Rebecca as well. While you may be young, you have a vast amount of experience that you have garnered in a hurry. So congratulations. When confronted with an issue of technology, I like to begin the analysis with looking at it from the human perspective. And I think that's particularly true with respect to artificial intelligence, where we need to figure out ways to enhance the positive benefits of that capability and mitigate the downsides. As human beings, we very much like to understand how our world works and what the rules are that govern our behavior and how decisions are made that impact our lives. With artificial intelligence, that's a challenge to be able to truly understand the inputs and the outputs and the machinations of these things called algorithms. But in many ways, the digital world is merely mimicking things that happen in the physical world. In the physical world, when we understand how things work, we have more trust in the system. When we're thinking about building a consensus on public and private data management and decisioning systems, which is what artificial intelligence is all about, we know that systems work very well when there's a foundation of trust, particularly when that trust has been earned objectively. But at present, trust as a foundation is in a bit of short supply when it comes to government institutions, at least in my country, trust has been on a steady decline vis-a-vis government's ability to solve problems since the time of JFK in the 1960s. Likewise, trust in big companies following the rules and doing the right things has been in a decline, particularly with respect to big tech. And while some of the big tech companies do things that are absolutely wonderful for humanity, they bring us together, they create a forum where we can have friends around the world and communicate basically free, in one sense free. At the same time, there's a general lack of trust about what they're doing with our data. And it's hard to have trust without rules. There was a comment this morning about the European Union being the regulatory superpower, and in many respects I agree with that, because in the United States, we've kind of been asleep at the wheel. I'm not saying that our Congress has not been trying to get things done, but for 20 years we have been trying to get a national data protection law, a foundational law of general applicability enacted by our Congress, and we haven't done so, even though things are moving more rapidly. There was a 90-page proposed bill that was filed yesterday by the chairman of the United States Senate Commerce Committee, Senator Wicker. And there are about 20 bills in Congress dealing with this subject. But the reason I point that out is that there's got to be a better framework, a boundary that is set by a comprehensive national data law on this side of the Atlantic that properly balances the interest of people, society, governments, and business. Creates a level playing field for new entrants into the field. It does not forever entrench big tech, but at the same time, it also allows America to be able to continue to think with data. Doing this will help rebuild trust. Boundaries have got to be set in order for people to be comfortable with their data being collected, used, and shared. Consider the analogy of the United States income tax regime. Every year, we Americans turn over our innermost secret financial details to our government. And yes, we're legally compelled to do that, but there's an extraordinarily high level of voluntary compliance with this data system because there are boundaries around what that for. Very, very strict boundaries. And if that information is used beyond those boundaries, there are consequences. In particular, people go to jail if they violate those boundaries. So the point that I'm trying to make is that if we seek to truly have a transatlantic governance system with respect to artificial intelligence, my country's got to get with it so that we at least have the outer boundaries set. And I always look upon the law as the outer boundary for permissible conduct. And in many areas, we have to fall back and utilize ethics because ethics will tend to keep us from going over that boundary or getting a little bit too close to it to where the downsides become very significant. So those are my opening thoughts this morning. I very much look forward to the continuing discussion.
Oh, thank you, Jerry. So again, let me ask the...
Thomas, I think I'm also on the panel. It's Paul Nemitz from Brussels.
Oh, Paul, hi. I don't know why. Must have had a very early list. So I don't know whether the last Paul or not, but please go ahead. You've worked with the Boston Global Forum before, so it's nice to see you again. So
thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I very much liked the last intervention. I think it's not fair to say the European Union is the world champion in regulation, and others are great in all the other important things for people, business, and public interest. If we look at how Europe is getting through Corona right now, exclusion made of the UK situation, I think we see that Europe is also good in many other things. And I think when it comes to the vaccine, we will also see who is the world master in innovation in this field, at least. So I think stamping Europe as a world master in regulation only is a platitude. And as we have heard from the last intervention, I think in the end, all the great mechanisms of talking with each other, and talking is important, and consultation in terms of multi-stakeholder fora and so on, in the end, they have to lead to action of the institutions of democracy. And therefore, I think what we are talking about is to catch up with the normal rule of democracy, namely that the important matters are dealt with by law, and it is clear that technology becomes ever more important in our life, as we have heard from our young member of the panel, and this trend will continue. Our lives are being colonialized by technology, and therefore also the law on technology must become more important, because the law in the end is the most noble expression of democracy. So I think it's important in these times of crisis of democracy not to talk down the law, not to repeat the platitudes of law being an obstacle to innovation, but rather recall that the law is how democracy finds its expression in terms of establishing what the majority wants in the law. And also the law has therefore not only democratic legitimacy, in contrast to ethics, which may come from many sources. I think on AI, we have now around 70 different ethics codes in this world. So we need this democratic legitimacy of making the choices of which way we are going in operationalizing the ethics. But also the second element of the law, namely that it is enforceable against everybody, becomes more and more important in a world in which some companies from the US and China in particular are more powerful than middle-sized states, and in terms of capitalization on the market, 10 times as big as the biggest European companies. So I think this question of power, namely how to enforce the law, how to make the good intentions really come through, which we have heard in the panels this morning, is a core question. And this must bring us back to the mechanisms and institutions of enforcement. And I think there we have to be very realistic. The hope for global enforcement mechanisms on the level of the United Nations and so on is a noble hope. And I think we have to always keep on working on improving the global system of international law and enforcement mechanisms. But history also tells us that these mechanisms which work on the global level are extremely scarcely distributed, and we have very few systems on the global level in terms of enforcement which really work. More close to the ball, I think in the United States, there are some institutions of enforcement who have a great history of good functioning. For example, in privacy, I think what we have seen from the Federal Trade Commission in terms of the fine on Facebook of 5 billion, I draw my hat to the FTC, because although Europe has a great general data protection regulation now, in terms of substantive law, we haven't seen such a hefty fine coming from a European data protection authority yet. So I think there are good things in terms of hardcore enforcement to learn from America and its history of dealing with power and concentration of power in the economy. For example, also the big debate now in America about breaking up Facebook or Google or Microsoft or Apple, which takes place in Congress and which plays a certain role in the campaign for the election. This is a debate which, at least until now in Europe, has not reached the political fora, because we in Europe do not have instruments yet to break up big companies. Our competition law is based on other structural and behavioral measures, but it has never been used, and I'm not sure it can be used to break up companies. So I think America has a lot to contribute, and it indeed would be good both in the material law area, and the previous speaker mentioned the lack of privacy law, and this is important for AI, because whenever AI treats people's data, personal data, it is important to have a law which sets limits, but also in terms of learning about the institutions and, let's say, the hard hand of enforcement, which here and there exists in America. For example, also in the area of taxation, there America normally enforces the collection of its taxes worldwide against its citizens. There, I think America has a lot to contribute, and Europe can learn from America. And the other way around, I think America can be inspired by the debates and works in Europe, not only on GDPR, but in Brussels, in the European Commission, we are now starting to prepare a legislative proposal to set down some basic goalpost rules for AI, such as the very simple principle that people must be made aware whether they're dealing with a human being on the other side of the communication channel, whether the communication is oral or written, that they are dealing with a machine and not a human being, because this is what is going to happen in the world of AI and is already happening now. We hear a voice or we read a text and we don't know anymore, does this come from a machine or does this come from a human? And this is not a harmless thing. In democracy, when we are asking ourselves, who are we going to vote for, and we see all these messages about this or that candidate or this or that opinion, and we don't know whether these messages come from a human or from a machine, this will completely distort the public discourse. So, this will be probably one of the rules which we will try to put into law. We are also working on the Digital Services Act, which will reform the laws on how business is done on the internet and how platforms work. And I think the general gist here will be to make platforms more accountable for what is happening within their control. I think the idea from the beginning of the 2000s, end of the 90s, that platforms are neutral, just technology platforms, and they have nothing to do with the content, and they are passive. I think this idea has now been overtaken by business models and technologies. All the platforms are extremely active in structuring, re-editing, presenting, selecting, making visible or not, distributing or not content, and therefore in line with their evolving business models, which serve, of course, to optimize revenues from advertisement, in law must also raise. And would like to close by saying privately find reality of this. We cannot continue to stand idle and watch how journalism, which has traditionally been called the fourth estate, the fourth power in democracy, goes down the drain. We need good structured investigative journalism. We need critical political reporting in democracy. In America alone, I think over the last 2 years, 14,000 journalists lost their jobs. This is more or less the same in Europe. It's a dramatic decline of the fourth estate. In the end, for a number of reasons, but probably the most important single reason is that most of the money on online advertisement only goes to 2 companies in this world, and this is the same in America or in Europe, namely Facebook and Google. And I think we have to keep this in mind when we are regulating platforms. We must also use this regulation in one way or the other to re-establish a level playing field between traditional journalistic media, which have a vocation to investigate and to work for the truth and which are the fourth estate in democracy, and the new platforms which have a different vocation and follow a different business model. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks, Paul. Again, I don't know, let me ask you again, was there anything that any of the other panelists said that you'd like to comment on before I ask a few questions?
If you allow, I would like to make 3 brief remarks. Is that possible?
Please. Please.
My first remark, Rebecca, you were born in 1986. You told that.
96.
Sorry?
96.
When you were born, in any case, in those days. 96. Oh my! 10 years before you were born. Then on innovation and responsible society. And I make a reference to those activities because if we talk about innovation, it must always serve society. And therefore, I would like to underline the importance of values and also the fact of trust. It has been mentioned. I fully agree with this. High trust economies are doing better than the low trust ones. So that's the first remark. And the importance of trust, values, and serving society. The second one, Jerry, you made the remark about the big techs. I think it's so important to underline the fact that if you want to talk about the new realities, it must be a responsibility of government, the corporations, and so on. You need everyone. And that's the reason why I am so in favor of having a social contract, but it depends on who are the partners, who are subscribing the content, and what does it really mean? It has to do with enforcement. You mentioned that. And Paul, I fully agree with your remarks about the role of enforcement. You can statements, you can have very nice criteria, but it depends always on the way, how can you enforce it? Well, in Europe we are used to it, and maybe also we should investigate legislation. For example, the climate change agreement in Paris, then it was agreed that countries should report every 5 years about the, as a matter of reporting. When we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, it is really important that we talk about implementation, taking concrete actions. So I think the regulation is one, but also other instruments. So thanks for your remarks. It was really enjoyed to listen to you.
Professor Patterson, may I follow on to something that the Prime Minister just, as well as what Mr. Nemitz mentioned as well. We would all agree that it is critically important to a properly functioning democracy that we have strong journalistic efforts. Journalism is rightly called the fourth estate because it looks over the shoulders and asks questions and brings a level of fresh air of transparency into the sometimes closed rooms of decisioning. And I'd really like to hear people's comments about this because to my way of thinking, what has happened with journalism is the economic viability, its business model was usurped by, for instance, Facebook and Google. Advertising and marketing has been the best cross-subsidization for the free press that's ever been invented. Journalism can't exist very often in a healthy manner simply dependent upon subscription-based business models. And yet there's been such a fast evolution, it's almost akin to the volcanoes erupting and the dinosaurs getting killed in a geographical sense. The digital world moves so fast that the physical world of journalism failed as a business model and got transferred into the technology companies. What can we do about that? Because that is a tremendous economic force that has tremendous power.
Yes. Thomas, if I can, I have something to answer.
Please.
So in my book, which the English title of which is The Human Imperative, Power, Democracy and Freedom and Democracy in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, which unfortunately in English will only come out in March of next year. In German, it's already on the market.
It's a very good book.
Thank you. I have described one issue where you see where we should be going on this question, namely the relationship between the income for journalistic media and data privacy. Now, for the business model of Google and Facebook, these two companies collect anything we read. Presently, they are present whenever you go on the internet somewhere and you read something. This means in this world, we have repositories which basically fulfill the dream, the Nazis, and the dream of the Stasi, the secret service of East Germany in the dictatorship, which is to know what people read at all times. Because that's what the Gestapo did first. When they had a suspicion about someone, they went to the library and looked, what books has this person taken out? And Google and Facebook know this totally because they follow us wherever we go on the internet. Now, I don't believe that, and they do it because by knowing this, they can best make advertising revenues. Now, I don't think this is a business model which is in the longer term sustainable for free and democratic societies. I don't want to live in a world where somewhere someone knows anything I have looked at. So I would much rather support a business model where third-party snooping on media websites is simply forbidden. Therefore, following a business model which is now, for example, developed in the US by the Washington Post, which is that the Washington Post analyzes its own readers and tries to make the most of it. But that's it. The data doesn't go to Google or Facebook. I think, that is typically an example where I would say, American technology can and American innovation can solve some problems which we in Europe would try to solve by law. And I think this theme of finding the exact substitution relationship between law and technology will be one of the great themes in the future. How can we solve a problem? And how do law and technology substitute each other, or how can they complement each other? I would say probably the likelihood that there is political agreement to introduce a legal rule which says on sources of political information, of journalism, third-party snooping is not allowed anymore, but the only ones who can collect the readers' data are the publishing houses and the journalists, if it's a blog, will become more likely to be adopted because of good political support if we can show that technologically and economically such an option is viable. And I think we are on the way to this. And I think we need this type of discussions like today to spread this good news. And then also, and this is what it always comes down to again, mobilize the legislator to adopt the rule which in the end is necessary to come to a system of the public sphere, of public discourse, of the fourth estate, and how people build their opinion in democracy, which is sustainable. Let's not forget that we have, both in the United States and in Europe, a long history of legally framing the public. We have regulated the radio, we have regulated TV, we have regulated newspapers, always because of a concern for democracy. And I think we should also regulate the platforms because of a concern for democracy, because, you know, democracy and its viability is more important than the profits of Google and Facebook. But I'm convinced, even with a good regulation for democracy, these companies will still be very successful.
If I may add a short comment into what Paul and Jerry have said, I think for democracy and the rule of law works, we need to have good mechanism for enforcement. And unfortunately, we don't have enough, or we never really have enforcement of other nation or other countries which does not share our value, our respect for the rule of law. However, I believe that even dictators also very sensitive to public shaming, public embarrassment. And I think currently with the technology we have, AI will improve our ability to basically call out countries that does not respect the common human value system. Even that, we still have not used that tool as often as we should. So I think it's very easy for the US and Western Europe, most part of Europe, to enforce regulation or to build regulatory bodies because we share more or less the same value system. But to do that effectively with other countries, we need to come up with, I think, more creative mechanism to enforce what we think is good for all of us.
And if I may, in here, we're talking a lot here about enforcement legislation, all those things. And I think before you can get to that point, you need incentive. And if we're talking about big tech trees and how to regulate them and the news that's operating on them, whatever, you have to start with the incentive. Thing that CGDF is trying to focus on is the civil society part, because at the end of the day, these tech firms and social media in particular are dependent on their users. Without the users, they don't exist. And so we can see the power of the users as well. And I'll bring up kind of a little example of a couple of years ago, Snapchat, and this is unrelated to journalism, but it's still related because Snapchat changed its interface, and one person, Kylie Jenner, put out one tweet about how she didn't like the interface, and their stock 6%. So that is incentive enough for these tech industries to listen to civil society. And all legislation, I think that there's still a really big knowledge gap at the free level. The antitrust hearings by the U.S. weeks ago, there was one woman who asked, a very question that I didn't think also was related to the hearing, but he said, "Why did you block this certain user on Twitter?" And the Face CEO goes, "I don't know. I don't own it. I think it may be killed, but I think that's representative of the complete lack of understanding of the tech industry that our current legislation has." And I think before we move towards legislation and enforcement, a level incentive that comes from the user and civil society. So that's my 2 points on what we're talking about.
Let me use that, Rebecca, thank you. Let me use that as a takeoff for a question. So almost every time that I've been involved in kind of multi-stakeholder efforts, every seat at the table has been occupied by the well-connected. And Rebecca's talking about the users, they're not the well-connected. And, I'm wondering as we move forward and trying to think about how we construct all of the devices and the like that we've been talking about, how do we bring some of these voices to the table? AI is a very substantial far-reaching effect. I think it was you, Rebecca, that talked about the possibilities for how we can help migrants, refugees through AI and so on. But how do we bring those kinds of voices to the table in these kinds of discussions in a way that really gives them some influence over what we do?
I can start. One, also jumping off of something that earlier about trust in the systems and making sure people understand what's working. I think in order to engage, bring people to the table, we have to increase their cyber literacy. And I think now a lot of people know how much data is being collected on them. I don't think that's really the problem. But it's really people don't know how that data is being used. And so people need to know what's going on, people know risks. Even right now, this morning, our TikTok, which is a booming platform right now, which has political implications, all of the above, that TikTok be officially banned on November 12th. I got messages in 3 different groups. So that's about that are soon that TikTok might be banned. And yet they know that TikTok has all their information. We talk about this a lot, but they're not really sure why that matters. Why does it matter if China holds all the data? And so I think in terms of bringing to the table, the first step is informing them about the risks. And a thing that CGDF is trying to first paper was about that and about risks of surveillance and how, in China, we see that they're using in court with the social media to target minorities and send them to ideological camps. So, the first step in engaging people and the users is informing them of what's happening, those risks are. And then to Jerry's point, you can, trust, but also civil society mobilize to ask for what they want. We saw talking about TikTok, a transition from Vine, which was a couple years ago, which was another huge platform, to TikTok. And that just shows the power that the users have. Vine was shut down, but another social media platform popped up that's the same thing, and all those users. So I think if everyone is aware of what's happening and more so what the risks of what's happening are, they will be missed to ask for new, and they really have the power and incentive for those companies. So that's what I think.
So Paul had a rather skeptical take on the role of organizations like the UN in trying to really kind of police this space. I'm wondering if any of you have a different take, have some optimism about the ability to get international organizations more deeply involved in ways that actually will have some teeth at the end of the day. They don't have the enforcement mechanisms, obviously, of sovereign nations, but are there ways that we can bring them more fully into this process and use the fact that they are collective entities, that they do bring nations together to move this along?
Shall I make a remark?
Please.
There is a lot of criticism on multilateral institutions. You can see the upcoming of nation states. And I must say it's sometimes confusing. And it's also worrying. We are living on one planet. There are a lot of global challenges. A global never can deny that if you have global issues, you also must have global solutions. And besides the world of tensions between the US and China, nationalism, there's also a global agenda. The global agenda of the Sustainable Development Goals, the climate change issue, the necessity to have a circular economy, it's all there. And if you are convinced, you must talk about multilateral institutions. And of course, you can criticize WTO, WHO. You can criticize the UN. There's not an alternative. Improve the functioning of those institutions. Because if we would, in fact, walk away from the multilateral channels, it's a big risk. We need each other. So it is a matter of taking the right choices, taking the right measures, underlining the necessity of the have a discussion about it, but focus on what should be realized on a global level. And therefore, the goals are okay, the SDGs, but it's a matter of how to implement them. And I think this is the key element. And therefore, you need and the governments and the business sector, civil society organizations. So, and if, let's say, if we would lose the importance of the multilateral channels, that's a big risk. And therefore, I'm so happy with this conference, social contract. It's an attempt, in any case, to make progress in the decisions. Because if you talk about those elements, it's only about or US or China, or we need each other. So therefore, I think we need multilateral institutions, but we have to improve their functioning.
I think when we talk about the concept of democracy, for me is the ability of ordinary citizens, ordinary people who can participate in the decision-making process. Of course, if we look at multilateralism, the UN, or those things, it would be hard for us to think of another alternative. But I think if we can imagine that with the current existing platform, Facebook, Google, whatever you name it, or they have provided a platform for ordinary citizen people to take part into the discussion of anything that the government or multinational government may do. And I think that if the advancement in AI can create even better platforms for people who, refugees, immigrants, people with low income, people in the far corner of Earth can have a voice in what we do. I think with the collective voice of people will have an impact on enforcement, on government policy. As I mentioned earlier, dictators, they may not care about other people, including their own citizens, well-beings, but they do care and they do want to be loved. Just think about that, right? So if we could call out their unacceptable behaviors, we are making progress to make our world a little better for all of us.
Okay. Professor Peterson,
I'm sorry.
The control room has asked me to summarize some of the comments and then turn it back over to Milburn for the official close. I have to say, this has been a wonderful and a very fascinating discussion. Many of the panelists today have talked about the different sources of power in a democracy. The people, the concentration of power in government, in large companies. And it strikes me that particularly now that we are in a digital age, that no one sector of society has a monopoly on public opinion, or for that matter, on power. And that as we move forward, we have to be cognizant of that and understand that not just nations have to work together to come up with rule sets, but other segments of society need to work together to come up with rule sets to govern such things as artificial intelligence. And it may not be perfect. In fact, it will not be perfect. And not all issues will be anticipated and not all issues will be solved. But to use the cliche, we cannot let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And we have to try to make progress where we can, when we can, and keep the dialogues going. There is always a bleed over between social media and artificial intelligence, because in the background of social media, there is lots of artificial intelligence going on with algorithms that are enhancing and accelerating the display of certain types of messaging and lowering the volume of other types of messaging. We all know that messages that are attached to human emotion tend to get more engagement. Think of how we operate as humans and then extrapolate that to how an algorithm works. And we also recognize that because of the immense scale of social media enabled and empowered by artificial intelligence, there are great opportunities to either unite humanity or to divide humanity and put us all into our own echo chambers. We know that there are ongoing efforts to utilize social media to sow dissension, to take advantage of fault lines and to go in and try to divide. Just yesterday, the director of the Federal Bureau of Intelligence Investigation, in the U.S., Director Wray gave testimony to Congress about how the U.S. elections are being attacked by misinformation and disinformation campaigns of an opponent, should I say an enemy of the United States, Russia. We have also seen how various companies are trying to turn into this issue and make things a bit better. Twitter, for instance, said a while back that they're not going to take political ads this cycle. They're taking aggressive efforts to tag misleading content, and they're removing manipulated videos. They're having to use a form of artificial intelligence to do this, as opposed to just rely upon human review of it because of the scale of the problem that is coming towards them. Likewise with Facebook. Facebook is an amazing company. They've created a worldwide community, but if they're going to invite that community onto their platform, they have to really be at the forefront of making sure that that community does not create harm. Microsoft, I have to commend what Microsoft is doing as recently as this week in announcing that they have come up with ways to utilize artificial intelligence to detect deep fakes by looking at the blurry boundary lines that would be undetectable to a human, to be able to say that this is not an accurate representation. They're also working on things such as hashing and digital certificates for content, so that we will have confidence and trust in being able to see certain content there. So I will simply close by saying that there's not going to be one answer on this. We have to try to encircle the problem from as many ways as we can. And if we can get a 5% improvement here and a 5% improvement there and 10% there, that's progress. I'll now turn it back over to Milburn. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jerry, for that great summary. Thanks to Professor Patterson for leading this panel, and a special thanks to our participants, Prime Minister Balkenende, Rebecca Leeper, Nam Pham, and Paul Nemitz.